What if having children wasn't just a personal choice, but a moral one? What if bringing a new life into the world wasn't an act of love, but an act of harm? Sounds extreme, right? But this isn't just some modern debate. It's a question that's haunted philosophers for centuries, and one of the most famous thinkers to tackle it head-on was Arthur Schopenhauer. Imagine this: if people had children purely out of reason, would humanity even survive? Or would we, out of sympathy for the next generation, spare them the burden of existence altogether? Schopenhauer didn't just ask these questions, he answered them, and his answers might shock you. Anti-natalism, the belief that birth has a negative value, isn't just a fringe idea. It's a philosophical stance that argues bringing new life into the world is morally wrong. Why? Because existence, according to anti-natalists, is inherently filled with suffering. If non-existence is better than existence, then creating life is essentially imposing a burden on someone who never asked for it. Now, this video isn't about anti-natalism as a whole. Instead, we're diving into Schopenhauer's take on the matter. And here's where things get interesting. There's a common misconception that Schopenhauer wasn't a full-blown anti-natalist. Some even call him a proto-antinatalist, as if his views were half-baked. But let's set the record straight. Schopenhauer wasn't just flirting with antinatalism, he was all in. Sure, the term antinatalism didn't exist back then, but his ideas laid the groundwork for philosophers like Emil Cioran, who later championed the cause. Schopenhauer didn't hold back. He believed procreation was a moral failing, a selfish act that doomed another being to a life of suffering. But here's where I want to hear from you. Do you think Schopenhauer was right? Is bringing a child into the world an act of cruelty, or is it the ultimate expression of hope? Let's debate this in the comments. Now we'll talk about the first argument, the origin of suffering. Let's start with how we experience the world. Schopenhauer says it's like we're seeing two sides of the same coin, will and representation. The will is this raw, undivided force. It's everywhere and everything, all at once. But representation, that's where things get messy. It's how we perceive the world, divided, fragmented, full of me versus you, this versus that. Here's the kicker. This split between the will's unity and representation's division is the root of all suffering. It's like we're all part of the same ocean, but we've convinced ourselves we're separate waves. Schopenhauer calls this illusion the principium individuationis, the idea that we're individuals, distinct from everything else. But in reality, we're not. Think of it this way. A wolf hunts its prey not because it's evil, but because it's driven by the same undivided will that governs everything. It doesn't realize it's both the hunter and the hunted, the destroyer and the destroyed. It's just following the same force that makes a stone fall to the ground. Now here's where it gets heavy. If this unity versus division tension is the source of suffering, then creating new life, having children, only makes things worse. Every new person is another fracture in the unity of the will. It's like adding another crack to a mirror that's already shattered. You're introducing a new subject, a new object, a new breaking point. You're literally creating more division and more suffering in the world. So, what's the solution? Schopenhauer's answer is stark. Don't have children. By not bringing new life into the world, you're refusing to add to the cycle of suffering. It's a radical idea, but it's rooted in this deep, almost heartbreaking view of existence. What do you think? Is creating new life inherently adding to suffering? Or is there something redemptive about it that Schopenhauer missed? Second argument, asceticism. Okay, so we've already talked about the metaphysical side of why Schopenhauer thinks having kids is a bad idea. But there's another layer to this, his call for asceticism. And no, this isn't just about giving up your favorite snacks or skipping Netflix. For Schopenhauer, asceticism is about denying the will to live. And that starts with something pretty radical, sexual abstinence. Yep, you heard that right. Schopenhauer believed that voluntary chastity was the first step toward breaking free from the cycle of suffering. If you're not having sex, you're not having kids. And if you're not having kids, you're not adding to the division and suffering in the world. It's a direct line from abstinence to reducing suffering. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Schopenhauer wasn't naive. He knew most people weren't going to live like monks, fasting, living in poverty, or swearing off sex entirely. He even admitted that for the average person, this kind of asceticism is way too hard. That's why for most of us, he focused on compassion as the foundation of ethics. But in his ideal world, we'd all be saints and sages, living in complete denial of the will to live. This is where things get a little confusing. A lot of people know Schopenhauer from his essays, which are more accessible but don't dive deep into asceticism. His main philosophical work, The World as Will and Representation, is where he really lays it all out. And that's why this part of his philosophy often gets overlooked. People think, oh, Schopenhauer's a pessimist, but he doesn't actually say don't have kids. But he does. He really, really does.